Hello again. So today we are going to look at another chapter of this Information Security Management and Assurance subject. If you remember, previously we have explored the role of law and ethics in actually making sure that our policies and rules can be used and also understood more by the people involved, which the asset that we want to protect. So for today, we are going to look at security planning, which involves the actual understanding of the policy, procedures, and guidelines that we want to implement in our organization. So there will be two parts of our lecture today, but remember, as always, please take a 5-minute break after you have viewed this video for about 15 to 20 minutes. And throughout the viewing, always remember to jot down what you want to ask or things that you don't understand, and feel free to ask me throughout the lecture. So for the first part, we are going to look at information security policy. So what is actually policy? So this part will explain and hope that you understand more about policy and its role in information security control. So before we go further into this chapter, I would like to just deliver one of the most brief and perhaps more easy to understand the difference between policy, guidelines, and also procedures. Okay, usually in any organization, you will see some sort of general rule about what to do or how to behave in a certain situation. So that is actually a policy. So for example, okay, that is a policy about how you actually need to protect your computer by having a strong password. So in general, a policy states that each user need to have a strong password. That's it. That is one policy. So how do you actually follow this policy to make it true? So this is where the guideline and also the procedures comes in later. So the guideline will actually give you some tips about how to actually have a strong and also a secure password, for example. And also the procedures will describe actually how do you actually go by to obtain a user account, and how do you actually write your strong password, and how do you actually store your password. Guideline is just like the tips. A procedure is the one that you need to follow step by step. So that is the difference there. Policy is very general, what you need to do or what you need to follow. And then procedures dictate what are the steps by step in order to accomplish the policy that's given to you. And then lastly, you have the guideline. Guidelines are just tips or something that come in handy to help you to actually follow the procedures, and also in lastly to follow the policy. Okay, so that is the general idea about policy, procedures, and guideline. Okay, so in general, a policy is something that you need to have in your organization, meaning that you deliver to your people that you want to follow, okay, to make sure that people understand this is very important to the security of your asset. And usually you have a team that actually plan about what you need to actually have in order to protect the asset. Okay, so usually a policy is generated when you have delivered it to the management, and you say that okay, we need this policy and it must be followed by this group and this group or this type of user in order for us to protect this asset. Okay, so the most important thing is that it must have a management support, and then the management will dictate and disperse this policy to ensure that all the people involved will follow through this policy. So the policy is set up by the policymaker and then is being endorsed by the management, and the importance is delivered by the management to ensure that this policy is important and must be adhered by the people involved. Okay, so a policy is the general idea what you want people to actually follow. That is one thing about policy. So why do we have a policy? First of all, remember that the policy is a very general rule that need to be complied by the people involved. So usually we have a policy because we want to actually reduce the risk. So usually we identify what are the assets they want to protect. So for example, we want to protect our staff data, for example. So the objective of having the policy, perhaps, for example, we want to have a policy that makes sure that all employee is protected by a secure password. So that is one policy. And the objective here is to reduce the risk of the user account being compromised. And then secondly, you must have a policy that comply with laws and regulation. So it must be made clear that if that policy is not complied, then there will be certain repercussion in terms of perhaps being penalized under the organization or perhaps under the law. So this is why when you write a policy, you must ensure that it is abiding or followed by the law and also perhaps following the social and ethical norm. And of course, it must have assurance with operational continuity, information integrity, and confidentiality. Simply put, it must adhere to the CIA. Because you have a policy in information security control, it is to protect your asset to ensure that they have the three factor there, the CIA. So whatever policy that you want to write, make sure that it complies to the CIA. Okay, and one important factor is that for policy to be effective, it must be properly disseminated. It means that it must reach the target audience, and then it must be properly understood, meaning the language is easily identifiable and easily understood by your target audience. Do not put too many technical jargon in your policy, because sometimes if people do not understand, they just simply won't follow through it. And then agreed to, and then uniformly enforce. Meaning if you say that you are going to enforce certain rule, if people didn't follow the policy, then you must follow through it and give proper reward or perhaps disciplinary action based on the action of the people involved. This is to ensure that whatever policy that you have written can be actually respected and followed through by the target audience. So having written a policy, what do we actually expect from a security policy? First of all, we want to focus on who do we want to protect. In our case, we want to protect the people and also the information, which is a very important asset to any organization. So we want to have a set of expected behavior from these people in actually administering the use of information and also the asset they want to protect. And also we want to actually specify who will be the designated people or the user or who will be actually managing this information. And then we have also set, let's say, if this policy is not being followed, what are the consequences? Okay, so the consequences can be either in terms of reward if people actually comply, or in terms of penalization if people actually don't follow the policy. This must be made clear so that it can either motivate or perhaps hinder people from actually going against the policy. And then it must have a proper consensus, meaning that when we write the policy, then we must have proper consensus that we agree, okay, that this is the right way to do in order to protect the asset. Okay, so it must be understood that this is the right action and this is the right thing to do. And then if people didn't comply, and then these are the consequences. People must understand this in the very first place before a policy is being enforced. That's why when you write a policy, it must adhere, first of all, to the law, to the social norm, to the ethics, and to how people practice daily in the organization, and people understand that this has benefit if people actually follow through it. And people must understand that having this policy, it will help to protect the asset, it will protect or minimize the risk, and we must also have proper way to track whether people actually follow this policy, okay, and if they follow through it, what are the benefits. Okay, so these are the things that you must remember when you want to actually write a policy and to make sure that people actually follow through and understand the importance of the policy that you have. So you might ask, why must we have a policy? Remember previously in the previous chapter, we have identified some of the problems of why some security control isn't successful. And usually from investigation, people find or organization will find that usually the cause is not the hardware or the software that they have doesn't actually settle the problem, but the problem lies in the people. So this is where policy comes in. So the policy here describe what is needed from the people using those hardware and software. Because you can have a very expensive software and hardware to actually protect your security asset or information asset, but if the people doesn't understand the repercussion or what to do with those assets, then your hardware and software control might not be successful. So basically a policy defines what you can and cannot do in terms of protecting your information asset. I repeat again, you have a policy, you describe what you need to do, what are the action that is correct to actually operate those information asset, either from obtaining the information asset or either from delivering those assets or either also in protecting those assets. So it must be made clear from the policy from the very get-go what is expected from the people handling that information asset and what are the repercussions if those policy is not actually followed through. And to make things easier for people to actually understand the importance of the policy, first of all, policy must not conflict with law. Every inch of your policy that you written, it must comply to the law to ensure that it can easily be followed through in terms of giving reward or also giving penalization. And then policy must also be able to stand up in court to actually penalize people that involved that doesn't follow the policy. So for example, let's say people leak your sensitive information. Okay, so this must adhere to the perhaps PDPA law. That is one example. And then when you have people that is actually violating those crime or actually violating those policy, then you can actually penalize these people in court. And then you must be properly supported and administered. It means that it must have management and organization support, meaning that all people involved in your organization must understand the importance of the policy, must know how the policy operates, and must know the exact procedures and guidelines to actually making that policy comes true. So here is an example of a security policy. Okay, as you can see from the example, okay, I'll give you a moment to read the policy after this when you pause the video later. So it describes actually the use of the policy here. So in this case, the policy is written for a data security policy and it describes the requirement of the employee. So using this policy in the description, what is the use of the policy, followed by the purpose and followed by the scope of the policy, means that who actually concerns with the policy and who is the responsibility, who must actually follow through this policy, and then the policy requirement here. So the requirement must be described in detail in order to comply to the policy what is expected from the personnel involved. Okay, so have a read through. If you have a question, feel free to ask me later on. So now, what is actually the difference between policy, standards, and practice? So this is where, first of all, the policy is the plan or the course of action expected from the people involved. And then from the policy, you have formed a set of standards. And then from the set of standards, you also have a practice that to adhere to those standards. Okay, for example, okay, I given you one example of policy. So example of policy, each employee must actually comply and also make sure that their personal information is protected at all times. That is a policy. And then a standard here means that in order to have those policy being followed, so perhaps there are certain action that needs to be followed through to make it a standard. Means that employee must always log in into their account, they must have a very strong password, or they must actually have passed the assessment or awareness program, for example. That is a standard. And this standard adhere to the general policy there. Now, what is of practice? So, in practice, we have procedures and guideline. Okay, so procedures will describe further in order to obtain the standard. For example, in terms of, let's say, the previous example is how do you actually have awareness program to the employee. Okay, so the procedure states that perhaps in order to go to the awareness program, employee needs to register. Where to register? Perhaps register to the HR office. And then where do they have to get the awareness program? Perhaps to registered organization. That is the procedures. And then after that, after going through the awareness program, they must actually report back to HR and state and bring back the certificate. So that are the procedures. So how is it different from guideline? So guideline is a set of tips in order to follow through with the procedures. So let's say in order to pass the exam, what are the tips to pass those awareness program exam? Okay, so how early must people come to work each day? That is a guideline. Okay, so by having the procedures and guideline, it must adhere to the standard, and this standard is followed through the policy that you want to actually achieve. Okay, so we will go through this later on in our exercise to make sure you understand and differentiate further what is the difference between policy, standard, and practices. So in terms of flow of having a proper direction, we first begin from the policy. Policy define what we want to achieve, and then policy will drive the standard in order to make the policy achievable, and then the standard will drive the practice, procedures, and guideline. Okay, so usually the very detailed one is in the procedures and guideline, and then this guideline and procedures actually follows the standard that we want to achieve, and then this standard actually want to actually achieve the policy that we written in the very beginning. So we have a look again in the example of the policy previously. So in this example, you can see that the policy lays out the do's and don'ts. What can be done, what cannot be done. And then from the policy, there's a set of standards. So for example, the standard describe visitor must always be escorted by at least one employee until the designated room. And then the procedure will describe the detailed instruction to follow in order to confirm the visitor or escort have indeed performed the task. So for example, it register and confirm at the entry, and then assign the employee, and then drop off the visitor at the drop-off point. And then lastly, guideline. So the guideline will come in handy in form of tips of how to be safe and aware of your fellow employee and visitors aside from the procedures previously. So you must have a set of standard, what is expected. You must have a set of procedure, what need to be followed to actually adhere to the standard. And then lastly, guideline as a tips to how to actually ensure that the policy can be easily achievable. So these are the examples of the relationship between policy, standard, procedures, and guideline. So when you talk about policy, there are three types of policy. First of all, it is for general enterprise policy. Secondly, a very issue-specific policy handling certain issues. And then also system-specific policies in terms of actually handling a certain system or software or hardware. So we will look at the next section for the difference between these three types of policy. So with regard to all the three information security policy that I've listed before, here are the further explanation of all those policy. So we begin from EISP with regard to the enterprise-related issues. So basically, EISP describes the overall policy that needs to be adhered by the individual and perhaps those who come in contact with the organization. So for example, the policy is that, let's say, a customer that comes into the organization will need to always register at the front desk. So that is an example of the enterprise security policy where each individual must be registered before they are permitted to enter. And then secondly, we have issue-specific policy. So issue-specific policy with regard to the use of certain resources. So for example, regarding the use of confidential document, for example. So each confidential document must be verified, for example, by the related individual that is going to use it or the one is authorized the distribution of that resource. So it must be very clear and is very issue specific with regard to the use of that document. And then the third one, we have system specific policies, usually in handling certain hardware or software or system. So usually this policy dictates who is the admin, for example, and who to report to if certain incident happen. So for example, each user must be registered into the system by the admin. So that is the policy with regard to the use of that system. Okay, so we repeat again, EISP is very enterprise related or enterprise oriented. It's much more general in nature. And then issue specific is much more targeted towards a certain issue. And then system specific is more targeted to the use of system, hardware, and software within the organization. And it usually is containing certain guidance or who to report to if certain incident happen for the use of that hardware and software. Okay, so we'll further explore these three differences in your assignments later. Okay, for now, just remember there are three different types of information security policy. So further guidance for EISP, it is usually an executive level document and it contains the general overall vision of the organization, and usually the length is 2 to 10 pages, and it contains the philosophy of the overall information security control that is want to be implemented by the organization. It assigns general responsibility, and at the same time it addresses legal compliance if certain policy is not being adhered or complied with. So this is an example of EISP, and as you read it further, you will find that it is very much more generic. It contains the purpose of the policy, the background, and also the scope of the policy and which does it cover. And usually, it also explains it is in compliance with what type of regulation and what could happen if those regulations are not adhered with. Moving forward, ISSP addresses specific areas of resources in technology. So basically, for example, just like I've given earlier, let's say you are going to distribute the documentation that is private and perhaps very confidential from a certain department. So ISSP dictates who is the person responsible to authorize such activities and what to do if, let's say, the document needs to be shared. So this is described in the ISSP and it's very resource oriented and needs to be updated from time to time to make sure that it's relevant with the law and also what is practiced in the industry. So these are examples of ISSP topics. Among others are not limited to email usage, okay, prohibition against hacking, for example, and the use of personal equipment, okay, the use of telecommunication equipment, and the use of photocopy equipment, for example. And as you can see, it is very resource specific and it handles each and every resource individually in terms of how it being used, who is responsible to make sure that it's used correctly, and what happens if that resources is not used correctly according to the policy of the organization. As for the content, Usually inside the ISSP, you have a clear statement of purpose, means that the overall objective of the set policy with regard to the use of resources. And then, for example, you have the authorized use, who can have access to the use of that particular resource. And then what can be done with the use of that resource and what can be prohibited and actually allowed with the use of the said resource. And then we also cover the system management, okay, who can actually manage that resource, followed by what happens if the said policy is not adhered to and there is a violation of the privacy, and then policy review and modification because it needs to be done from time to time to make it more relevant and more current to the current standing and happenings inside the organization. And also limitation of liability. It means that what is covered inside the policy means that if let's say fire, does it cover the use of or the violation of the use of resources, for example. So the limitation of liability must also be covered inside the ISSP. And lastly, we have the CSSP, which is the System Specific Policy. Again, this is usually for configuring software and hardware inside the organization that is being used for security control. For example, how to do certain things for a firewall, for example, and then how to set specific access control for the use of that software and hardware. So this can be separated into management guidance, who is responsible, for example, which personnel is actually responsible to use the software and hardware and actually configure the hardware and software. And then the technical specification, okay, what to do, how to do this, for example, what is the flow of the operation of the system. And then it is combined into the single policy document containing the management and also the technical specification at the same time. Simply put, CSSP contains the thorough guideline and what needs to be done in terms of managing the system and hardware and software for your security control. So in a nutshell, in order for policy to be effective, first of all, you must follow the industry accepted practices. So you must follow certain models, and also you usually go to benchmark on other organization and see how they do things there in the organization. And this organization must be similar to yours so that the policy can be tailor-made to actually fit your organization. And also, after that, you make sure that you distribute using all appropriate methods, either through email, for example, through the use of posters, or perhaps you perform talk in order to deliver whatever you envision in your policy to your target audience. And then, of course, you ensure that it is understood and read by all the employees or target audience, followed by you must make sure that the language is easily understood by the targeted people that you intended the policy to be followed through. And of course, it must be formally agreed by the management so that it can be enforced or perhaps be applied. And if anything should happen or if there isn't any compliance with the policy, certain action can be taken. And then of course, you must ensure that whatever you say in the policy is uniformly applied to all levels of the target audience. This is to ensure that you have a very effective policy once you written it, and you ensure that the vision that you written the policy for can be applied and also can be achieved. Whichever policy that you aim to develop, either enterprise, source specific, or system specific, you must always view the policy as a three-part development project. Okay, first of all, a very good policy must be designed and written properly with the set of team. So you must have your proper team to actually think through about what you want to write or what you want to achieve from the policy. Secondly, a senior manager or executive of the appropriate level must review and formally approve the document. It means that, remember, you have the top-down and bottom-up approach. So usually, writing a policy is a very much top-down approach. You begin discussing and designing your policy with the management team, and then your management team need to approve the policy that you are writing to make sure that it adheres to the law and perhaps can be upheld in the law should something happen. And then lastly, it must be properly disseminated by the management to make sure that it reaches the right target audience and all the people actually understood what you write and what you want to achieve from the policy. So remember, policy is a three-part development project. So why is writing policy must be designed properly and thought through? Because you want your policy to be easily understood, and when people understand it, they have much more motivation to actually follow through what you want them to actually do. That's why you must always run through your policy that you are writing and also perhaps have your target audience as a reference when you are writing the policy. So you must make sure that you have minimal technical jargon so that your target group easily understand what you want to achieve or what you want actually from the policy that you are writing. Which is why you must do follow-up assessment when you are writing a policy. So let's say you have a draft of a policy, you have one sample of the target group, and you can try to deliver and perhaps give the draft of the policy to your reference of the group. So if let's say the target group fully understand and what you want to actually achieve is easily understood from the case study group, then you can make sure that then you can be very sure that the policy that you are writing can be easily understood and perhaps can actually get its objective done. Okay, so you must identify your target group, which employee can actually be referred to represent the target group, and which employee actually requires further training. For example, if let's say what you want from that policy cannot be easily understood. Okay, so from the assessment, you can identify whether your policy is easily understood, or perhaps if it's hard to be understood by the target group, what can be done to enhance the understanding for that target group. So make sure it is easily understood and make sure it reaches the target group and easily understand by the target group. That's why in the previous chapter, it is also important in the requirement stage for you to identify your target group when you want to actually implement certain security control. So policy is also part of the security control, which involve the things in terms of in writing, and what you want to achieve is delivered in writing, and you must ensure that what you do in writing is easily understood by the target group. Another important point that you must understand when you write a policy, that your policy must actually comply with the existing law, and it must be easily upheld in court if let's say something happened. And usually when writing a policy, it must follows a set of standard. Okay, either you are following the ISO standard or you are following other security standard. So it must be made clear what is the reference for that policy and what policy and what law can be actually upheld if there is a violation of the policy. Okay, and then also it must be made clear, okay, if let's say the policy is not adhered by a certain employee and they not agree to that policy that you are writing, so it must be very clear that that is the vision of your organization, and if let's say that said employee is not willing to follow the said policy, so there must be repercussion in terms of perhaps the employment, or perhaps there is some sort of disciplinary action that you can take on the said employee by violating the policy that jeopardize your asset that you want to protect. And lastly is of course the issue of policy enforcement, which is why when you write a policy, you must make sure that that policy is actually supported or aligned with certain law and certain standards. so that when you want to enforce that policy during a violation or crisis, that policy is upheld and can be actually accepted by the court and can be punishable in terms of something disciplinary or to the perpetrator of the one who violated the policy. So you must make sure that whatever happens or if certain policy is not being followed, there is a swift disciplinary action or certain action must be accountable from that incident. Because it's no use if you have a policy setting this and that, but it's not actually upholded in terms of certain implication of certain breaking of the policy, or if people can freely break or not follow the policy to begin with. So when people see that your policy is not good enough to be followed and can be followed through, then your policy is actually something that can be dismissed and cannot be followed by the people of your organization. So you must make sure, okay, when you write a policy, it must be aligned with the law and perhaps at least the ethics and can be upheld in the court of law should something happen. So in part 1, we have covered the importance of designing a proper policy and also the type of policy that you can write in order to protect your information asset. So before we continue to part 2, you can take a 5-minute break or perhaps read through again what is needed from the previous part. And then for part 2, we are going to continue on the framework, models, and blueprint that can also be used for writing your policy and to ensure that your policy is an effective one. Usually, in the industry, there are certain security models that we have taken as the template. So, usually, these models are the reference that is being used by industry to ensure that their practice is according to the industry standard. And usually, when writing a policy, procedures, and guideline, this model serves as a stepping point for the organization to actually tailor-make their policies, their guideline, and their procedures to ensure that whatever they do is according to the standard of the industry. So, one way to select a methodology or adopt an existing security model is to see whether, first of all, the model that you take is actually fit for the problem that you want to solve. Just like in your final year project, for example, you follow a certain methodology to adopt in order to develop your solution. So the security model is also like that. You pick a security model based on the problem that you want to solve and according to the industry that have used them, and then you actually adopt that model to fit and also suit the problem that you want to solve. That is the use of the security models. Usually, in terms of providing a proper security solution for an organization, it will begin from the security plan, followed by the security framework to be adopted, and it will also produce the blueprint for the solution. Basically, the security plan is envisioned by the management. So what does the management want in terms of protecting which asset that it deemed important? So from that, it also assigns selected individual in order for the task to actually being executed. So from that, a proper security framework or model needs to be adopted based on the vision from the management. So for example, in this diagram, we have the cyber security framework to actually protect information data. So other organizations perhaps can adopt other framework based on the vision or the plan envisioned by the management. So from there, from the very model that they adopted, then came the blueprint that is tailor-made based on the vision of the management and also adopted from the framework to actually provide the solution that they want to protect the asset that they want to actually protect. So the flow begins from the management and selecting the framework, and then it will produce the proper blueprint based on the solution that they want tailor-made to their organization. So at the end of the day, what we want to have is a proper blueprint to actually implement whatever security solution that we want. Remember, it begins from the security plan envisioned by the management in terms of protecting which asset that it deemed important. After that, finding the correct model or framework to adopt, and then only you produce the correct blueprint to solve the problem or to provide the security solution to your organization. And usually, to ensure that the blueprint actually fit your organization, you can actually select the framework based on the industry standard or see what other people have done. Usually, this is done by having a benchmarking visit to the similar organization or partners and see whether that solution actually fits or actually solve the problem. And then perhaps, according to the new blueprint, you can either follow the benchmark or perhaps you enhance whatever the existing blueprint and tailor-made and making sure that it suits your organization to provide the proper solution for your problems. So from the blueprint, you can actually produce the security architecture model. So this security architecture model actually contain all the necessary components to ensure that whatever blueprint that you have planned earlier have the necessary component to be successful. Usually it contains the hardware and software information, where will you place it, you have the proper personnel that you want to place in strategic location within the organization, and either you have a logical or perhaps a very physical design, and then also follow practices and also policies that can actually support the hardware and software solution. So this uh, solution usually focus on the main aim of the CIA and to ensure that whatever you want to protect the asset for actually covers those very important aspect of computer security, which is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the asset that you want to protect. So for architecture or framework that you want to adopt, or even the policy that you want to write, you can actually follow the industry standard or these existing models that you have learned perhaps in cyber security essential or computer security subjects before you taken this subject. So I will not delve further into those models, just that we browse through or glance through in this model that what is it covered by those model. So for example, if you want to look at authorization model or confidentiality model or integrity model, you can look at the trusted computing based model, the Bella Padula model, or the BIBA integrity model. Or you can combine this model together to ensure that they provide the solution that you want. You can also look at Clark-Wilson integrity model for access control, and then Graham-Denning access control model, followed by Harrison-Russell-Ullman for access control also, and also Brewer-Nash, the Chinese wall, and the common criteria for policy writing. So these are just a few models that you can actually adopt to suit or to write your policy or to base on when you actually make your framework to adopt or you want to produce your blueprint for your security solution. Of course, there are many models out there. These are just a few that has been adopted by the industry. And on this page, we look at the security management model. So this can be used perhaps for auditing the information security, uh, let's say obtaining data, for example, managing data, or you want to assign suitable personnel in order to protect your data, how to actually do auditing for this security asset. So these are some of the models that you can actually adopt for security management. Usually the most common one are the ISO 27K or the NIST security model. So those are the industry standard being used for security management. Other standard you can use the COBIT, the COSO, the ITIL, and also the ISGF. Okay, just the key point here is to use industry standard and ensure that you have a copy for your reference later on, perhaps when you are working in the industry. Because who knows, you might be the one that is doing the managing or you might be the one who actually provide the solution, and perhaps the one who comes to organization and audit other people implementation. Okay, because you are future cybersecurity professionals, the way that you can actually use this knowledge is very vast. So usually, in having a proper industry standard of practice, or perhaps in doing things, we usually follow ISO. So what is ISO? ISO is basically the international organization for standardization that is based in Geneva, Switzerland. So usually you will hear ISO this, ISO this, or ISO that. Okay, but basically ISO is the standardization body to ensure that all industry actually doing the same thing and actually talking the same language, so that whatever is being practiced by other organization is following the standard. And if let's say something happens, there is something or somebody that we can use as reference so that proper violation can be dealt with or can be rewarded properly. So this usually covers how data is handled, how actually transaction is being handled. So everything which makes an organization work in terms of documentation, in terms of protecting data, is covered by the ISO. Particularly for security, we are following the ISO 27001 standard. So basically, what is the ISO 27001? So if you are a security professional, the ISO 27001 is the standard that you must actually know. It actually covers anything with regard to initiating, implementing, maintaining, and improving information security management system. So any organization that is using IT system, okay, must actually follow the ISO 27001 standard. It covers all the things basically in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, and also in terms of where data is obtained, how data is collected, and how this actually data is actually being maintained and actually being kept. So whatever organization that is using data or actually managing data and also modifying this data, they need to follow the ISO 27001 standard. Okay, so basically that's it for today's session. So what have we learned today? So basically for today, we look at the importance of policy, procedures, and also guideline in terms of providing the solution to protect your information asset. Usually, it is not enough for you to have a very sophisticated hardware and software to protect your information asset, but you might also have the proper policy as the vision for the organization and also for some target for your people to actually follow through when they are actually dealing with the information asset that you want to protect. And then for part 2, we look at certain framework or model that can be adopted in providing the security solution for your organization. So the most important key point of having a proper security model is that you must follow the industry standard so that whatever happens, you can have something to refer to and it can actually be authorized and also be upheld in the court later on. So that's it for today. So I will be giving you some exercises for you to follow through to actually enhance your perhaps knowledge and perhaps understanding with regard to what we have covered today. Okay, so by that, I thank you for joining this session and I see you again in our next session. Thank you.